Hey everybody, thank you so much for having me as a speaker for this virtual conference. My name is Alison Macrina. I'm going to talk to you today about what I see as one of the most important intersections of technology and innovation for libraries, which is digital privacy. Next slide. Just a little bit about me and my background. I am an internet activist. I was a librarian for a little less than 10 years when I started the Library Freedom Project. The mission of my organization is to make real the promise of intellectual freedom in libraries by teaching about privacy and advocating for it in library spaces and in our communities. And I also work for an organization called the Tor Project. We make anti-surveillance software. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Tor and some of the related things that we do. And I now work on Library Freedom Project full-time, teaching librarians and working on privacy in our spaces. Next slide. So when I was asked to speak at this conference, I started thinking about the theme of technology innovation and what that means to me in the age of big data and ubiquitous surveillance and other things that are not so great on the internet. And as far as I'm concerned, the most innovative thing that we can do as librarians when it comes to technology is use strong privacy tools and make our library spaces privacy protective by default. We hear a lot about different kinds of innovative technology, and it seems like over and over again, the innovations, while they might be interesting or they might provide convenience to our lives, again and again, they are violating our privacy or even our consent when it comes to the sharing of our personal information. So my feeling is that, as librarians, our ethics demand that we innovate in ways that are protective of those very ethics, of things like intellectual freedom and privacy, because I think that they're inextricably linked. You can't really have privacy without intellectual freedom and vice versa. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is some ways that you as librarians can innovate with technology that is privacy protective, how you can bring privacy into your library through education, through advocacy, how you can teach yourselves about privacy tools and best practices. And I've got a lot of resources to share with you that are appropriate for no matter what skill level that you're on right now. Next slide. So I want to just get started by saying that the problems of privacy in the era of big data are pretty massive. We are facing surveillance, the likes of which the world has never seen before, from all different kinds of sources, from governments, from corporations, from individuals. I just want to make it clear at the outset that I'm not any kind of tech evangelist. I don't think that technology alone can save us. I think that what we really need are broad political solutions, that companies need strong regulations, that governments need to be governed by the political will of the people. But those things, those kinds of solutions that are massive, they take a lot of time. What I think we can do in the meantime, as individuals and in our communities, is take steps for harm reduction. This is a term that is used often in public health language and things like that, and it applies to privacy, technology, and the internet as well. And what is meant by it is that if you can take some smaller steps, they will still help protect some of your privacy. You might have some leaked, you might still have some privacy violations, but you can still reduce the impact of whatever it is you want to protect yourself against. So with that approach in mind, I'm going to teach you a little bit about thinking about how surveillance affects your community, about strategies and tools to protect your privacy and the privacy of your patrons, and then ways that you can teach others and also teach yourselves. Next slide. So just to go over the agenda of what I'm going to cover in this talk, I'm going to introduce you a little bit more to Library Freedom Project and Library Freedom Institute, which are the organization that I run for library privacy. We're going to talk about the concept of threat modeling and what that means in libraries. We'll go over some basic best practices for digital privacies, a little bit more on the kind of strategy or how to think about these things. And then we will go to some privacy tools that I think make for very good starting points, and then additional resources for learning and teaching about privacy. And then I will close with a link list to everything that I talked about, as well as my contact info. I would love to hear from you after this session. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, Library Freedom Project's mission is making real the promise of intellectual freedom. And we do this by teaching librarians and their local communities essentially about three things. We teach about privacy threats, so where violations to privacy exist, what is happening in the news, in the courts, with regard to the law and things like that, policy. We teach about privacy rights. So we have a protected right to privacy in the United States. People may be familiar with the Fourth Amendment. Privacy rights exist at the state level to different degrees too. There are, a little bit more granular levels of privacy in each state. And also there are ways that our other rights relate to our right to privacy, the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment and some other ones. So we talk about how our fundamental rights as human beings relate to privacy in specific. And then the last set of things that we teach about are privacy technologies and privacy strategies and best practices. So some of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. So most of the time, Library Freedom Project does workshops for librarians at conferences or staff events, things of that nature. A couple of hours here and there. We do webinars. We create curriculum for privacy education, and we try to provide other resources for librarians who want to get into the privacy fight. Next slide, please. So the other side of library freedom is a fairly new effort called Library Freedom Institute. It is a collaboration between New York University and the Library Freedom Project, and it is a 6-month free institute funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services that is for a select group of librarians to become privacy advocates. So over the course of a 6-month online training program with one in-person component, our advocates learn about things like what we cover in our shorter Library Freedom Project workshops, much more in depth with assignments and guest lectures from people around the privacy world. We do practically focused work. We do readings and discussion and things like that. And actually, Josh Stone, who is helping run this conference, is one of the members of our first cohort, and we love him. And so I'll stop embarrassing him right now. I'm going to talk to you at the end of this talk about the next cohort of Library Freedom Institute and how you can get involved in it. But we're running the first one right now. Next slide, please. So pivoting over to some of the strategies for privacy, I want to introduce you to a concept called threat modeling. Sometimes it's also called a risk assessment. And I think this is an important point for librarians to get started with when thinking and teaching about privacy, because threat modeling is the best answer to understanding kind of where a person might need to begin when it comes to her privacy, where somebody can learn about what she has to protect, and it kind of can situate an individual in a practically focused sea of privacy information. So here's how threat modeling works. It has 4 components: assets, adversaries, capabilities, and consequences. Every single person on the planet has a threat model. Everybody has a set of things that they want to protect and people they want to protect it from. So, You start your threat model by thinking about what your assets are. Who are you? What do you have to protect? Depending on the kind of life you live and the work you do and the communities that you're a member of, your assets are going to vary. Assets can include things like your browsing history or messaging, can include physical devices like a phone or a computer. And your assets can also include the people that you know and interact with, your entire social network. Your adversaries are people that you want to protect that information from, people who are likely to want to exploit that information. So adversaries can include, for some people, governments. It can include corporations. It can include ex-boyfriends. It can include bosses or school principals. All of it depends on the individual and what her threat model includes. Capabilities are what your adversaries, frankly, are capable of when it comes to exploiting your privacy. So how much time and effort they are able to put into trying to exploit your privacy, the resources that are available to them, money and motivation. And so thinking about the capabilities is important for what lengths you want to go to help protect yourself. And then finally, the last thing to think of is what are the consequences? What happens if you fail to protect yourself? Is it just a matter of an annoying data cleanup? Is it something much more threatening, like losing a job? Everybody is different. And by starting with thinking through a threat model, you can think about whether you need to go to the lengths of, encrypting with a little bit more difficult tools like Tor browser, or whether you just want to create stronger passwords. I think that librarians are an interesting group because we have kind of an innate understanding of threat models because we serve members of many different kinds of communities. So, thinking about this with specific patrons in mind, or thinking about the many different kinds of people who come into your library is a helpful framing to get started. Next slide, please. So I guess you could call these kind of some, basic precepts, best practices, conceptual things to think about when it comes to protecting privacy. These are overall good strategies, no matter what tools you use. Specifically, these are, if you have these things in mind when you are choosing pieces of technology or making policy decisions, you're going to get pretty far. So the first one is data minimization. In all things, we should be reducing the amount of data that we collect, whether it is in ILSs, with specific patron information, whether it is with browser settings. The less data that we have, the less likely that data is to get exploited. And this has to do too with our personal practices, the way that we use social media. If we choose not to share our location information with Facebook, that is good harm reduction, because Facebook might still know who you are, but they don't need to know where you are necessarily. And if somebody else gets Facebook's information about you, then you're reducing the potential impact if they don't know everything there is to know. The next one is something called end-to-end encryption. Encryption is basically just the process of taking a piece of data and scrambling it into a secret code so that it can only be read by the intended recipient. End-to-end encryption means that it is encrypted from start to finish. So, different endpoints can refer to different pieces of hardware or computers, technology, but a typical end-to-end encryption relationship would be something like, I have a phone, I send an encrypted text message to my friend, it is encrypted on my phone, it's encrypted as it travels over the wire to my friend, and then it's encrypted on my friend's phone as well, end-to-end encryption. So there are many different kinds of end-to-end encryption, but that's the way you want your encryption to work. If it's not end-to-end, it's really not going to work, because if it's in plain text at some point along the way, then somebody could read it and they could exploit it. Another thing that is really essential when it comes to protecting privacy is updating software. It seems like, it's always kind of a pain. You get the little notification that your phone has an update or something else. You have to delete some photos to get things ready. Software updates, while a little bit of a pain, are incredibly important for privacy because typically software updates include some fix to some security vulnerability that's been discovered in the software. And so by keeping your software up to date in a timely way, you are protecting your privacy by preventing the exploitation of whatever security flaw has been discovered. Ad blocking is something that is really essential for privacy. Ad blocking also comes in a few different forms. There are different extensions or plugins that exist for browsers to block ads, and we're going to talk about one a little later. There are ways that you can change your browser settings to limit third parties. But any way that you do ad blocking is very good because ads are collecting lots of information about you, and they also can be serving you those ads in insecure ways. And so, you know, ads are basically kind of a mess just across the board, and preventing them from seeing you effectively is really good for privacy, not just from the advertiser, but in general, because they're so insecure. And then lastly, having a good set of privacy policies in your library. And by privacy policies, I don't just mean specifically a privacy policy, but I mean policies that are privacy focused. So internet use policies, vendor agreements, and things like that should be privacy protective by default. And so actually the first resource that I'm going to share with you is one that is something that you can use to create really strong privacy protective policies. So next slide, please. So that resource is called the ALA Privacy Guidelines. I have linked it in the link list at the end of this slide deck. And the ALA Privacy Guidelines are a really incredible resource created by the Intellectual Freedom Committee and the LIDA Patron Privacy Group and a few other ALA working groups. They have a set of checklists that go along with the privacy guidelines where you can basically go through and check off what your library is doing that's in their best practices. And I love these guidelines because they cover a lot of ground when it comes to your library environment. So there's a set of guidelines and checklists for vendor agreements. There's one for there's several actually for different parts of your library system. So your public access computers, your website, your some of the back end stuff of your system, your traditional privacy policies themselves, and then also your ILS. So it's a really good place if you're just kind of overwhelmed thinking about where to even begin with your library environment. That's exactly what these guidelines were created for. Next slide, please. Privacy tools can be pretty overwhelming if you've tried to get started with thinking about privacy and you've done a search for, you know, what different tools should I use on my phone and my computer. There are many out there. It can be hard to tell what's good and what's not. So I'm going to give you a few that I know to be really strong and trusted. They can get you started. They're great for most threat models. They're great for harm reduction. And they can be either installed on library computers or taught in computer classes. And then after I tell you about some of these tools, I'm going to show you some teaching resources that can help you learn those tools in more depth, and also some other tools that I'm not even going to cover. And they can also help you when you're teaching these tools to other people. Next slide. So the first tool is your password. Passwords are sometimes in security and privacy circles, they're thought of as the biggest vulnerability on the internet because it's an easy way for someone to get into your information and exploit your private data without a whole lot of effort. And the reason for this is because most people's passwords are very weak. Unfortunately, we've learned really bad password strategies, and coming up with random, unique, and complex passwords for every new account that we use is actually quite difficult. It's another thing that's a pain. So the method that I'm going to show you is one that I think is memorable and strong. You don't have to do, all you have to do is set it up, and then you can kind of just let it keep working and then add your new passwords to it in a very easy way. So it consists of two components. So the first thing is creating a master passphrase with something called the EFF DICE method, which I have linked in the link list at the end. So you create a very strong master passphrase, and then you use this master passphrase to log into your password manager. And the password manager stores all of your other passwords securely. It has a password generator in there. And that way you just have to memorize that one master passphrase, and then the password manager does all the other work for you. So I recommend a few, but honestly, many of these are created the same way. LastPass is good. 1Password is good. Other password advice, I recommend using two-factor authentication whenever the service that you're using allows it. Two-factor basically means that you get a code to another device that's in your control, and you enter that code, and it's just double proof that you are in control of this account. Security questions are a big vulnerability. I recommend lying to them because it's easy to find out the answers to your security questions by looking on your Facebook page or whatever. And then you can store the lies in your password manager. And then just one last thing to note about passwords is that your mobile device doesn't need as long of a password as your password manager or your laptop or desktop does, but you should use at least a 6-digit PIN. The 4-digit is no longer considered to be secure since about 2 years ago or so. Next slide, please. And this is just a screenshot of LastPass so you can get a sense of how a password manager works. You can see on the left, there's the login. You create an account, you log in with your email and your master password. And then on the right is a screenshot of LastPass in action. It's a browser extension. It works for Chrome. It works for Firefox. And you can see it has a bunch of different features for storing passwords and generating new ones and creating secure notes and other fun stuff. Next slide, please. Web browsers present some unique problems with privacy. Folks may have seen that something that came out this week is that Google is now forcing logins. Google Chrome is forcing you to log in to your Google account. And they're not yet syncing all of your Google browsing data with your Google login. But to me, this presents a really big problem for privacy, because as these services that rely on data, Google is a data company. They make all of their money from advertising. The more they are asking us for login information, the more they're trying to consolidate information about us, the more likely our privacy is going to be violated by them. So some better options for web browsers are in order of what your threat model might be. So Firefox is a great web browser. Firefox Quantum is the newest version of Firefox, and it's really fast. And they have some much better privacy defaults. Brave browser is a really interesting model dealing with the ad problem. Brave does ad blocking as a default, and you can read more about Brave in the link list at the end, but it does this in some really interesting ways. And then finally, Tor browser is for people who want even more privacy. It's the most privacy protective browser by default. It even hides your location information. It prevents advertisers from knowing anything about you. It can be a little bit more difficult to use, but I really recommend downloading it and trying it out for yourself, and especially just getting used to it, because if you encounter patrons who might have a little bit more serious threat model, it's a great tool to have in your toolbox to understand, to be able to help them with. So that gets you started with the web browser itself. But in order to have safer browsing when you visit websites, there are a couple of other components. So one is using HTTPS, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then the other one, I called it ad blocking a little bit, third-party blocking. It's basically the same kind of thing. Advertisers, web analytics, A/B testing. There's all different kinds of creepy crawlies that will follow you around the web, and it's a good idea to block them by default. Next slide, please. So you're probably familiar with HTTPS. It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. It's the encryption, the end-to-end encryption standard for websites. if you're familiar with it, you probably know that what it does is it protects, essentially protects your privacy on websites. It makes the packets going back and forth confidential because it encrypts them. But some other things to know about HTTPS is that it also gives you some other privacy protections by giving you data integrity, meaning that the content can't be tampered with when it's on its way between you and the server on the other end. And this is very important because if that data gets modified in some way, if it's plain HTTP and somebody tries to inject something malicious in the code that's coming back to you, then they can install malware on your computer, and that can be used to spy on you. And you don't want any of that. The third thing that it does is it protects against a certain kind of attack called a man-in-the-middle attack, where it prevents a website from, it authenticates, it shows you that you are definitely on the website that you intended to visit. So by using HTTPS, you get all three of these things in one. And I realize that it's kind of a difficult thing to tell people to use because you don't control every website in the world. But if you see the lock symbol, if you see the HTTPS at the beginning of the address, you know that your data is more secure than if you don't see that. And then the other screenshot I just want to point you to is that when you're using HTTPS, if something goes wrong, you will get a notification like this one that says your connection's not private. Sometimes you get this notification just because the security certificate on that website is out of date. But you might get this notification if someone is trying to tamper with the site that you're visiting, if somebody is trying to hijack it with a man-in-the-middle attack or something like that. With regular HTTP, you wouldn't get any notification. You would never know, and you might be the victim of a malicious attack. Next slide, please. A really great resource for getting HTTPS to be the standard across the web is something from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I'm going to use a lot of their resources in this talk, you'll see. So this is something called CertBot. It is part of a bigger project at EFF called Let's Encrypt. And Let's Encrypt's mission is to get all websites to be using HTTPS by default all the time, totally free, automatically renewing. And CertBot is their little tool that can set that up for you. So if you go to the Let's Encrypt website, you go to certbot.eff.org, you can see how this works. And this is a little bit more technical, but if you have some higher technical skills, this is a great thing to learn how to use, because then you can help patrons use it if they're setting up their own websites or something like that. It also can be used for library websites. If this is outside of your technical capacity, don't worry. Most web hosts will offer, they'll set up HTTPS for you for a small fee or sometimes for free. It's becoming more and more of a standard, so it's really not as difficult as it used to be. Next slide, please. One of my favorite third-party tracker blockers is another tool from EFF called Privacy Badger. And on the next slide, please, it shows you a little bit about how it works. So I like Privacy Badger because it is, first of all, it's run by this organization, EFF, that I think very highly of. Privacy Badger is another browser extension. It works for all the popular browsers. And basically how it works is you install it and then you don't have to do anything about it. But if you click on it, it will show you a little bit more about what's happening. So you visit a website and that website will communicate some information to Privacy Badger about what third parties it's sharing your information with. And if Privacy Badger sees that the website itself is collecting cookies from you, it will put the little slider in the yellow. That means that it will block those cookies. If the site is sharing information with other sites and following you to other sites on the web, it will put it in the red. So it'll block all that content from them. You don't have to change the slider settings at all. And actually, I don't recommend it because you may inadvertently block some third party that is necessary for the site to function. Like sometimes there are third parties that deliver videos and images and things like that. So it's kind of cool. You can like peek under the hood a little bit with Privacy Badger, but it works without you doing anything to it. And it shouldn't break any sites. It shouldn't have any unintended consequences for patrons should you put it on library computers. Next slide. Another great resource is the search engine DuckDuckGo. It's just duckduckgo.com. Now this one is actually surprisingly, even though it's just a search engine and you can get to it very easily and use it very easily, this is one of these privacy tools that actually presents some problems with convenience, because the thing is, Google search is a very sophisticated search engine. They've been collecting your data for decades and refining it, and they know everything about you and what you're likely to click on and search for. And frankly, DuckDuckGo doesn't know any of those things because they don't track you. And so you will notice using DuckDuckGo that the search results are not always as robust. But the way that they will get better is by more people using it. And so if you are going to use DuckDuckGo on library computers, I recommend, a little caveat about like, it's not going to work the same way as Google, but if you care about your privacy, you don't want Google to know or anybody else to know the sites that you visit, this is something good for you to try out. Next slide, please. Another great tool, moving away from web browsers, is an encrypted texting and calling app called Signal. So Signal is unique among all text apps in that not only is the contents of your conversation end-to-end encrypted, and like I said, you've got encrypted texting, you can make encrypted calls, and you can have encrypted video chat, but Signal works for all platforms: Android, iOS, macOS, Windows, and Linux. It's got desktop and mobile platforms. And it doesn't store any metadata. So the information about who you communicate with and when is not stored. And that makes it different from, let's say, WhatsApp or iMessage, where the contents of what you talk about are encrypted, but the metadata can be discoverable. And, just getting back to threat modeling, if your social network, if the names of people that you communicate with, if that is part of your threat model, then one of those messengers sharing that information might be threatening to you. And, when you think about who owns these apps, who the platforms ultimately belong to, WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, and Facebook makes its money by collecting data. So the only thing to know about Signal that I didn't mention is that both people have to have it installed for it to work, but it's totally free and it's quite easy to use. Next slide, please. So now I want to tell you about some additional resources that can help you if you want to get started in teaching and learning about privacy. I'm going to mention them here and then I'll go into them one by one, what's kind of different about each of them. So I told you already about what Library Freedom Project is. We maintain a repository of teaching resources on our website. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, I've talked a lot about them. I realized, let me take a step back and tell you a little bit about exactly who they are. So the Electronic Frontier Foundation, they're kind of like the ACLU, but just for the internet and for digital rights and things like that. So they protect our rights on the internet. They have a legal team that works on policy. They have worked with the ACLU a great deal on things like suing the NSA for mass surveillance, and a number of other legal and policy projects like that. But they're pretty unique in a rights-focused organization in that not only do they have this law firm, this legal team, but they also have a whole technology team that develops tech tools for protecting your privacy. And so far we've talked about Let's Encrypt and CertBot that they maintain. We talked about Privacy Badger that they have built. They've made a number of other tech tools, and then they also have a whole activism team. And their activism team works on things kind of similar to what Library Freedom Project does, where they make resources to help people understand how to use privacy protective technologies. So I've got two of their resources listed here. One of them is called Surveillance Self-Defense, and the other one is called the Security Education Companion. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what each of those are and how you can use them in a second. And then another organization, Tactical Technology Collective, they are based in Europe, and their main kind of mandate is helping protect human rights defenders around the world. So they have a pretty global reach, which is interesting when thinking about the kinds of threat models that they are that they're conversant in. They are kind of, they're pretty similar to EFF's EFF's activism team, and they make a number of resources for helping protect yourself and kind of learning about your security and all these things. So we'll talk about their resource in a little bit. And then finally, Hack Blossom's DIY Cybersecurity for Domestic Violence, focusing in particular on that threat model, which we'll get into in a second. Next slide, please. So Library Freedom Project's resources, I've got a little screenshot of our online privacy basics. I created these resources from teaching many different privacy classes for library patrons across the country. So in addition to teaching librarians, I've also taught a lot of just regular community members. And so I try to create these resources with most people's skill levels and most people's threat models in mind. Now, I realize that's a pretty big thing to say. You know, everyone is a little bit different, but I found that a lot of resources for teaching focused on a skill level that I wasn't experiencing in front of me. So this there's a basics course that I think is easy enough for anybody to get started with. There is one that focuses on youth privacy. There's one just for librarians. There is a mobile privacy course. And with Library Freedom Project, we're actually creating a whole set of additional resources. Library Freedom Institute, since our assignments are practically focused, they are turning into resources that will go onto the resources part of Library Freedom Project that any librarian can take and use and modify and turn into something that works for their community. Next slide, please. So the first of the EFF learning resources is Surveillance Self-Defense. So this is a really interesting set of, they call them playlists. And basically, they're organized by different kinds of threat models. So there's a basics one. There's one for journalists. There's one for human rights defenders. There's one for young people. There's one for LGBTQ people. And they go through, you choose the one that works for you. And then I have just a little screenshot of what you can find in a typical playlist. So animations and videos and really accessible resources about using specific strategies and specific tools. So earlier when we were talking about passwords, I mentioned using the password method with dice to create a master passphrase. I have a link at the end of this presentation for understanding this, but you can also watch the Surveillance Self-Defense video to understand it if it's a little bit harder for you to get the concept just reading the text. So I love this for teaching ourselves, for going a little further into some of the privacy tools that I mentioned to you. And this can make for good teaching resources as well. But EFF has an even better resource for teaching classes. It's on the next slide. So this is the EFF Security Education Companion. The link is on the link list, of course, sec.eff.org. And this is kind of the next step. You've done you've downloaded the tools that I told you about. You've gone to surveillance self-defense and learned a little bit more in depth of each of them, and now you're ready to teach other people. So you can use some of the Library Freedom Project resources, of course. The Security Education Companion goes pretty far in helping people become digital security educators. So there are all kinds of tutorials, things to understand about teaching, ways to get started, making your courses interactive, and they're translated in 11 languages. So it's a pretty incredible resource, and this is a fairly new project from EFF. So, what you see on their website today will probably be expanded in a month or in 2 months. So they're always adding more. Next slide, please. Tactical Technology Collective, one of my favorite resources from them is something called Security in a Box. And it functions a little bit similarly to the surveillance self-defense resources. They focus a little bit more on kind of tactics and mindsets rather than tools. I think SSD is a little bit more tool focused. So it's really just a matter of whichever approach works best for you. But I think that, you want to get started, you should browse through the resources from both of these organizations. And you can see in the image here just some of what they cover: protecting your device from malware, getting rid of sensitive information, keeping communication private, staying anonymous on the internet. So some higher level threat models too. Some really interesting and useful stuff. Next slide, please. And then the last teaching and learning resource is the DIY Cybersecurity for Domestic Violence resource from Hack Blossom. And, this is the only specific threat model that I'm talking about, but I think it's a really important one. Domestic violence survivors are people who quite often get their private information exploited. Their abusers have a lot of tools available to them. And this is a resource that was created just with this particular threat model in mind. And while some of the other resources cover it a little bit, this one really does it so well and with a lot of compassion. And so, I've just got, one of the particular tools, or rather guidelines, I should say, that they have on the site is for if your partner or your ex-partner is harassing you through social media. There's another one if you're being harassed through messaging, if someone's trying to dox you, if they're trying to find out personal information about you, like your address or things like that. And so, the other thing to know about this is that while it focuses in particular on this threat model, there's useful information kind of no matter who you are and no matter what you have to protect, but definitely important should you encounter people who are dealing with this specific threat. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that we're going to start recruiting for the next cohort of Library Freedom Institute. So I just want to reiterate, the applications are going to be open for that cohort in December 2018. And you can get more info and look at the previous application guidelines. They're mostly going to stay the same at libraryfreedomproject.org/LFI. Like I said, it is a totally free program. It's 6 months long. It's mostly online. There's one in-person component, but the costs are covered. It's really fun. The cohort right now is an awesome group of people, and we're really learning so much from each other. And, the eventual goal is basically to create an army of librarian privacy advocates. So I would love it if you would join us. To apply, you can write to institute@libraryfreedomproject.org. Like I said, we're going to open it up in December. I mean, if you send your application sooner, I won't reject you. If you have more questions, you can certainly feel free to contact us there. Next slide, please. So I realize that this is a long list of links, but you can just leave it up for people to see. This is all the different tools that I've talked about so that you can go and download them directly. And then the formatting got a little bit messed up at the top, so I'll just read out my email address. It's allison@libraryfreedomproject.org. If you have further questions, I would love to hear from you. If you implement any of these things in your library, I would love to know how that experience went for you. Please feel free to get in touch with me for anything. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciated being here.